Hello, welcome back. I'm Greg Farrar, and this is my COVID-19 Trends live stream. Okay, good. Looked black on my little screen for a minute there, but here's my data. We'll just get right into it. I'll be looking at the countries of the world, I'll be looking at the states of the United States, and I'll be looking at the counties of California. Hello, welcome back. And there I go again. Okay. So, countries as usual, total cases dominated by the United States. Behind that we have Spain, Italy, Germany, France. None of these are likely to change anytime soon. United Kingdom might. United Kingdom seemed in the past few days to have passed in total cases Iran, and Turkey is there in whatever that is, 7th place. I typically focus on the new cases, or even a level below that, the cases, the growth of new cases per day. That's this graph. Here again, this graph is completely dominated by the United States. Far more new cases in a day than anyone else, which is interesting. And the other interesting thing here is, as we've been seeing, there's a real sort of a falling off of the trend, an attrition of the trend. The curve is now starting to turn a little bit south, but eyeballing it, we can really see we have a lot of evidence that this thing has turned the corner, is heading down. And the rope chart, the next chart or the one after that will show that in a more numerical way, where we can actually see that in the United States growth rate has dropped below zero. So the trend line, as usual, a little bit pessimistic here in imagining that this is just going to keep going up. That's not what I see. I think it's actually going to be heading down. I'm going to zoom. I'm going to go to the cases by million. Sometimes when I do this, I have this situation where, for reasons that I don't understand, maybe I'm just misoperating my dashboard, or maybe it's a bug, I end up getting only dots. I'll double click something to try to make it go away, and suddenly I will lose my trend lines. When that happens, then I have to reload, which takes 10 or 15 seconds, which is a shame, but that's how it goes, I guess. We have, so the daily cases per million. So this, as a whole, this whole project of mine of presenting this data has not gone quite the way I would have expected. I would have expected to see one at a time, every country turns the corner, every state turns the corner, every county turns the corner. I can just say, there goes Kansas, there goes, I don't know, Japan, and then eventually it'd be over, and all of them would have turned the corner, and maybe there'd be a second wave, but there'd probably be a delay between it. And it's not really, broadly, I guess that's how it's working, but there are cases where the second waves are coming right on top of the first wave, and so my work here continues to be exciting, I guess, in that it's not just see how it turned the corner, there we go, now we're really done, but oh, here's one who turned the corner, and now they seem to be coming back. We fortunately aren't seeing that for the really big ones. Spain and Switzerland, who obviously have turned around, but we saw it a little bit for South Korea, and what we're really going to see later is that seems to be happening in the counties of California. California as a whole had been doing well, but not so clear that it is now. But that's in contrast to the countries of the world. In countries of the world, when we first started, we're all headed as upward lines. Now we see a lot of downward turns, as the number of cases is so obviously heading downward that even the trend lines believe it. There are, however, still more exceptions to that than being the rule. Spain, certainly, Switzerland, Italy, Austria, all significant countries in Europe with major outbreaks, have seem to be getting over it. They've have fewer and fewer new cases each day. That's still Austria? Yeah, that's still Austria. And then I think Iran also shows some evidence in that direction, and some of these smaller ones we can't see so well in this graph, but they'll pop right out in the next graph. But then we have, well, the United States, of course, though we saw in the last graph This is going to have the same shape as the last graph if we zoom in on it. It really looks like the United States has turned, but its trend line doesn't say so yet. Belgium, really not at all clear that it's turned, though it's had a couple of good days. So it just keeps shooting off. Belgium has been a real, to me, a surprise loser in this race, or winner in the race, depending what the destination, what the finish line is. But Belgium is way ahead in million, other than Ireland, which has been shooting up even faster. And then the United States, but again, I don't quite believe that trend line. I'm sure it's mathematically the correct fit, but from what I would say a common sense perspective, that trend line doesn't look like the way that we would guess the actual trend of the United States is going right now. And we'll see that on the next slide as well. So Ireland and Belgium are the surprising ones. They were never doing well. I don't remember ever saying, oh, Ireland's turned the corner, though I might have. Let's take a look back at Ireland, see if there was a time when it seemed really to have gotten over this. Because I remember thinking that about Great Britain, or about the UK, actually. Yeah, I mean, you could say if we had drawn a line right here, say, or maybe right here, there are a few places where there had just been a very low point, or right here, where we might have said, well, we have 1 point suggesting that we may be recovering. But those points seen in retrospect were certainly noise, and I'm always very reluctant to take any 1 point to mean anything. Even 2 or 3 points isn't enough to mean anything, even though these are a rolling average, these points. So each of them actually does already do some noise reduction by combining 3 points around them. So one really high or low one won't affect it. Still, Ireland has just seen a consistent trend upwards. It has never shown strong evidence of recovery. The UK, I thought the UK had, nope, the UK also solidly upwards, no sign of recovery. I think actually if we look on the next graph, we're going to see there is a sign of recovery. And the sign is that this curve is bending downwards, but there's no sign that it actually has clearly peaked at this point. It's headed there maybe. We'll see on the next graph. I'm going to get there soon since I keep talking about it. But I do want to look at Belgium then. Well, actually looks like Sweden too. Yeah, Sweden, see, this is why I did this analysis. You look at this graph and you're like, oh no, Sweden, they're going off into infinity. And you can barely see that it's starting to curve downward. But on the next graph, we're going to see something different. So I'm just going to skip on, not look at Belgium after all, because the rope chart is the one that really tells you where things are headed. We can see these lines and say they're going up on the previous graph, but when we see none of them are going up on this graph. And that means that even though all of those graphs look a little bit dangerous, at first glance, you say, uh-oh, everyone's going up. We're getting more and more cases. Yes, we're getting more and more cases, as we always will, but we have fewer and fewer cases each day. So even though the total number of cases that we've ever had will always rise, we never suddenly unlose or suddenly unhave or unregister. We never lose a historical case. They're always there, so those numbers, so the first graph will always rise. The graph we just saw will flatten out eventually, and we can guess when that's going to happen, when the number of daily cases hits, when it stops growing. That is this zero line, where the growth of daily cases hits zero. And looking at the world as a whole, again, this has been consistent for some time now, including, arguably this has been, we could see this coming as early as March 15th. Until then, all these lines were really headed upward, and it looked like, sure, this might blow up and we might end up getting 70% of the world infected. But around March 15th, for whatever reason, and there are lots of theories, and certainly shelter in place and better testing and, fear are good ones, the virus started its decline, in the sense that we started seeing a decline in the daily growth rates. That happened a long time ago now. March 15th was pretty wild west out there, but after that you can see most of the lines start to converge, and now they're all kind of straight, with few exceptions. So a long time ago, we saw this trend, and this trend has taken most countries below zero into negative growth rate. So great, we're doing well as a world at controlling this thing. As of today, the only even remotely horizontal line is Ireland. That's right. That's the one. Actually, so is this one. Italy, interesting. But Italy is below zero at least. So going horizontally below zero is not a serious problem. You're still seeing fewer and fewer new cases each day. This one here, Russia is looks a little dangerous. They're going at a 15% growth each day, 14%, but they do show a slight trend of decreasing that. So they also, at least, are not the worst case is to have a diagonally upward line. Above zero. If your line is above zero, if it ends above zero and it's heading upward, that is the worst case. That means that you have positive exponential growth and it's accelerating. And none of the countries have this in this top 25. Not even Ecuador, which was in Japan, which were looking a little worrisome before. We had these high points of Ecuador, but now 3 days in a row, Ecuador has done well with negative growth in new cases, and suddenly they're starting to drop off this top 25 again. They just poked their head in there a few days ago. They may disappear entirely from this list. If they keep this up, they will. Japan, which was 25th yesterday, I think, also, and I think even yesterday it was horizontal or slightly up in the trend line because we didn't have this point. Let me just make sure for a minute that's a real point. Sometimes we see zero cases and that blows everything up. But no, Japan does have a real point. It's just that the rolling average, the average of 3 days is now averaging these 3 days, which are nice and low, rather than say these 3 days, 2 of which are quite high. And so this point ends up being, or the average is much lower, and so the growth rate looks much lower. So that's real. This data is real and reasonably robust. It's got a couple kinds of averaging, smoothing going into it already. And it trends downward. So we see here we're watching Japan play this very delicate game around the zero line, or even around the zero slope of its growth line, which is to say, is its growth rising or falling, and is it positive or negative growth? Right now, we've got a great mini trend downward from this extremely high number to almost zero, to well below zero, to way below zero, 4 days in a row. We're not going to see that trend continue. I guarantee it for many more days. It can't possibly go to less than -1 anyway. So we'll see some more data points around here, and it'll just be a matter of the noisiness of this signal, given the number of, or the few number of points we have, relatively few number of cases we have. This is a pretty noisy signal, and it's hard to guess which direction the trend line is really going. The trend line has its own guess, and that's well grounded in mathematical reasonableness, but yesterday it said slightly up, now it says slightly down. So there's Japan, even Ecuador pointing down now as of today. South Korea pointing down. It had a few high days, though it's not in serious shape compared to the rest of the world, since it's still got good controls in place, and it seems likely to me they're going to continue to keep their epidemic under control. But these are all the bottom ones. Normally I look at the top ones, but I don't even need to. The top ones are going to all have this same characteristic pretty much of they're slanted downward, because everything has that characteristic. All the countries of the world are seeing decreasing growth of new cases daily, which is great news. I will look at the top one just to see, are they above zero or below zero? Here's the United States, still the leader in cases, but doing quite well with about 5% drop of daily cases each day. Here's Spain doing even better with a 11% drop and decreasing. The United States is also decreasing at a fairly good clip. Let's see, since the 10th, it's dropped about 6%. And so it's the 15th now. So what is that? 6% every 5 days, 5% every 5 days. We can imagine if this trend continues that in 5 more days, the United States will be seeing a 10% a day or 11% a day decrease, which would wipe out its new cases pretty quick if that stays. Italy, well, So this is the other line we said. This is kind of an outlier. The world as a whole is doing well and having a downward trending growth. Italy isn't. They do have a negative growth, which is certainly more important. Well, I don't know that it's more important. Certainly important. It is sufficient, barely, to say that you have 3% fewer new cases each day, and you're just going to hold steady at that 3%. That will very gradually get you out of the epidemic. But it sure would be nice to see Italy back where it was a week ago, where it was seeing negative 13% or many days in a row, well below zero. It does actually have a couple days now, so there's some hope for Italy that it will resume its downward. But it still has a lot of cases, and so 3% isn't really good enough. Germany is looking great. France is looking very good. So 9%, that's fine. That's just fine. If you've got 9% and you're sloping down, you're fine. France is going to be fine. United Kingdom, a sharp slope downward is good, but it's only just crossed zero. I mean, I can't believe I'm saying it, because just a couple weeks ago it was like, if only these cross zero, they'll turn the corner. The number of times I've talked about turning the corner in this podcast as the goal. But United Kingdom, so yes, the United Kingdom has turned the corner, but now its competition has stepped up, and it's not, it doesn't put you in the top to have just turned the corner. In order to be in the top, you need to have turned the corner and be 10% dropping, have a 10% negative growth rate, and have your growth rate dropping. So in this, the United Kingdom, and this top 6 is actually the worst in some sense, though you could say Italy's the worst, got a slightly better drop in new cases, but the trend is not as nice as the UK. Iran doing fine in the middle of the pack there. Turkey. So we had to get all the way down to Turkey here. Turkey, which had a really wild graph a while ago, has mellowed out, grown up, and joined the rest of the crowd here in just this very sedate downward path. But we had to go all the way to Turkey to find anyone who wasn't obviously dropping each day. Turkey is growing very slightly, way under 1% of growth, practically at the zero line, turning the corner right now. All the rest in the top are dropping. Belgium, interesting. Given how Belgium, how many cases they've had per capita, and how they're dominating that per capita graph, or at least they're this major player in the per capita graph. It is surprising to me, and they're in the top 10. A little surprising to see that the trend line claims they've turned the corner. I can only say that when we look at this as a whole, well, there are a couple, a mini trend downward, maybe even 5 days downward as a mini trend, if you kind of include this in the trend. But what's the big picture, I guess you could say, is there's an upward line here. There's sort of a flat line here. All these points are clustered roughly around the 120 mark. And then this is a plateau, you could call it, right here. And then a downward trend. And so that's probably where the math is going with this, is saying, well, it's taking these pretty seriously, given that there was this plateau here. Or it's a very noisy plateau, but still, arguably, this was an area of, though it went up and down a lot, it hovered around 120 for a long time, or 115. So anyway, Belgium, according to the trend line, turned the corner. Netherlands, fine. Canada, fine. Switzerland, fine. Well, more than fine. Switzerland's doing really well, sharply downward, and 15%. And then Brazil, which has been a point of some concern, as I keep mentioning. Pretty noisy, these points, but still we see a clear trend. You can eyeball this trend pretty easily. There are these spikes suddenly here and there, but generally most of the trend is downward, and by that trend Brazil has turned the corner and appears, we're really going to have to keep an eye on this one. But Brazil appears to have turned the corner and not have suffered too much from what the news says is not a lot of concern about controlling the coronavirus. Russia, however, is in trouble. It's not actually Russia is in terrible trouble. I was going to say Russia wasn't in terrible trouble. The only thing they have going for them is their growth rate at least isn't growing. But they have a long period of 20%, almost 20% daily growth, between 10 and 25% daily growth every single day for more than a week. And that will blow up your numbers. And so we should see here in the Russia, first of all, should be reasonably high in this list. Where is Russia? Why can I not? There it is. Well, it's not that high. Per capita, Russia is still quite low. Actually, it's down here, 13 out of a million actually in new daily cases, versus Ireland, for instance, the worst, which has 165, more than 10 times as much. So Russia has not, even though they've had this gives you a sense, they've started rather low, gives you a sense of how long you really can go with 20%, 20%, 20%. It takes a long time for these curves to catch up with the countries that have been doing this for months and months. But if this does continue, it's going to be doubling and doubling and doubling every few days, and we'll see Russia actually making more of an obvious contribution to this curve. But I do believe Russia was, let's just look, was completely off the charts. Yeah, as recent as say March 26th, they were nowhere to be seen in this chart. They were at 1, and remember 160 was the top of the chart. They were way over 100 times smaller in new cases, and now we see this curve. This starts to look like almost an exponential curve, but you can see maybe the dots are kind of flattening out. Maybe the line is going straight, and when the line is going perfectly straight, that's not exponential. That is actually something that looks here like a flat line, horizontal. And so when this line is flat, it at least means we're not seeing exponential growth in new cases. We're seeing the same number of the same amount of growth. And we're seeing 20% more new cases every day. Which, I mean, that is, I never quite know whether I'm using the word exponential right. There are different, it's growing growth. It's growth of like a parabolic growth or something along those lines. Polynomial growth, but not exponential in the mathematical sense, but it's growing superlinearly, faster than just going up as a straight line. And we do see this. If we're getting 20% more cases each day, that's not a straight line. That's going to be a 20% growth of new cases each day is what is that going to do? It's going to get you up to the top pretty fast, the top of the graph anyway. I'll have to ponder exactly how to describe that for tomorrow's lecture. But we want to see this line headed downward. It's only slightly headed downward. And so Russia is, I think, the worst we've seen here. Let's just take a look at all of them again. Yeah, certainly Russia. India also worth a look, because India is another one we're worried about. Looking a little better than Russia. Growth rate's smaller. It's had low growth rate for 3 days in a row. And as we watch this, there's I'd say a mini trend of a week where it's really coming sharply downward. And it could hit, if that trend continues, we'll see points below 0 again in just a day or two. And then eventually, pretty soon, the trend line will say, yeah, this has turned the corner. So given the population and the way they live together in India, there's a real potential for that to blow up. But so far, the measures they're taking seem to be working. I think I mentioned Sweden, but I'll just look at it again. Sweden, which has taken a more hands-off approach to the epidemic, a little more personal responsibility, a little less government mandate, seems to be doing okay. They're in the middle of the pack. They certainly aren't winning the way that some of the other European countries have, but they're not running away with an epidemic either. So Sweden's approach seems to be working. I guess I'd say that way. It works in the sense that it's controlled. It's controlling their epidemic. Cases worldwide. We still see, as we look worldwide, when we include all the little countries, we still see our trend line doubting that the world has turned the corner. I had my earlier graph that said 5 days ago that the world had turned the corner, but it didn't take population into account. When we actually throw all the countries in, there's still this, there's a pretty good big growth rate worldwide as a moving average of 3 days. And so the trend line, it's good, it's downward. Again, the trend line we really hate to see is above zero and upwards. The trend line we really like to see is below zero and downwards. But above zero and downwards, I'd say is third place. That's our third favorite because it means we're headed in the good direction and we'll turn the corner and everything will be fine. The fourth option, below zero and upwards, means we're shrinking, but we're also heading back towards epidemic territory. So I don't like to see any of the upward lines, but above zero and upwards is the one that we really don't like to see. And again, we don't see that anywhere here in any of the countries. So countries continue to look good. In terms of deaths, I'm spending too much time here, so I'm just going to roll through here quickly. The growth of deaths, you can see the rope is slightly angled downward. Deaths are trending downward. We have this extraordinary one, Sweden, which for whatever reason is having a great time with deaths right now. Very few are very swiftly dwindling deaths. We'll see if that's just some sort of an outlier, but right now they're certainly or if it continues that way somehow, but at least in lives saved, Sweden seems to be winning this, even though their cases aren't looking all that great. Ecuador, France, Switzerland, Netherlands, Austria are doing the best. At the top we have Russia. Again, Russia really is the world's upcoming epicenter. We see this right now. It's not angled upwards, so good, but it does have this steady upward growth to it, which is going to bring it to the top. I forget where Russia first appeared here. They may actually have crept in from the bottom, even in just the past couple of weeks, but right now they're in the middle of the pack, and if they keep this line horizontal and don't manage to bend it downward, they're going to stay there, or they're not going to drop again, rather than they're going to rise towards to be a major factor in the world's cases. They have quite a lot of people, and they have every ability to be the new number one if they don't turn this around. So Russia is the worst news here. Well, actually, let's look at this one. Japan, again, this is the question. The 4 ways you can be: above zero, below zero, and then upward sloping and downward sloping. We have Russia here and Japan. And I ask you, which is worse? Is it worse to have 20% growth rate every day, but to have that steady, or is it worse to have a mere 9% growth rate, but have it trending sharply upwards? I would say I'd rather be Russia than Japan in this case. And this is in trend of deaths. Japan will pass Russia and head off to infinity if this trend continues, and Russia will just continue to. It's still an epidemic with a steady growth rate, but Japan's is accelerating sharply in terms of deaths. Everybody else is pretty good. These deaths tend to look a little worse than cases on these graphs because they lag by a few days. So if the world is looking very good in cases right now, it might look very good in deaths in 5 days or so. And you can see a lot of these lines are downward. A few of them are slightly upward. Italy is seeing maybe a very slight increase in deaths, or the decrease in the rate at which deaths are dropping. But again, it's below zero. Note again that the similarity between the deaths lines and the cases lines. This is about what Russia's case growth line looked like as well. There's there should be a lag, but sometimes it seems like there isn't much of one between the death line and the cases line. But overall, this isn't bad. Japan is bad, and Russia really is kind of, it's in a dangerous place, but most of the world is looking pretty good here. And even those aren't looking at the worst we've seen. We've seen 30% growth rate and sharply upward in the past couple weeks in some cases. So no one's doing that. Japan, I'm guessing, is going to level off in a matter of days. We're not going to just see it continue up at this sharp angle for days and days and days. And Russia is taking steps, and I think they're also going to trend downward in the next few days. Eventually, everyone trends downward, turns the corner, and it's over. And we have yet to see any country. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to say we have not yet seen any country with significantly more than 1% of the population infected. We don't really know what those numbers are, but in the cases of the total infections, including ones we never tested, never knew about, but evidence that I've seen, including the study in Iceland, and there was a study somewhere else that I don't remember where it was. It might have been a state of the United States even, that suggests that when you do a randomized testing of a bunch of people, you find that less than 1% have or have had the virus. And that's, if that's true, then it means we're never talking about herd immunity in these cases. Herd immunity is 70% people have it, and so most of the people you come across have already had it and can't get it, and it changes the whole dynamic. It's what we have with many of our common illnesses right now. But we have tried very hard to put a lid on this COVID-19, and it appears to me that in the cases that I've seen, that the virus has not penetrated more than 1% into the population. And that's certainly true in Iceland. Now, Iceland is just one country, but I'm watching the news carefully to look for, is there a country where 10% of the population has had it? I've seen no evidence of that. So given that, what seems to be happening in every single country in the world is they start getting it, they start accelerating, they get scared, they lock everything down, they madly test, and then they bring it to an end, to a peak, and it drops off back towards zero. We haven't really seen anyone reach zero. China sort of is headed there, and South Korea maybe. But it appears to me that when people are afraid enough to put social distancing and heavy testing into place, that they do peak below 1% of the population. We'll see. That is a speculation and not supported by much evidence, but I also haven't seen any evidence to the contrary. I've just heard a lot of hysterical posts about herd immunity and how, I'm not even going to go into all the theories, but my theory is we have not exceeded 1% worldwide or in any country. That is a bold prediction, and it may be wrong, but even if we've gotten to 2 or 3% somewhere, it's still a very different story than imagining that we all have had this. And even 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, we were looking at each other and saying, we probably have all had this thing. But that's not true. It's not true, I don't think. And once testing comes online even more, we'll be able to get this sense of, if we test 100 random people, how many people have it, how many people have the antibodies, and then we'll know. Actually, I'll correct myself a little, that the testing done in Iceland was virus testing, not antibody testing. So the fact that 0.86% of Iceland had the infection doesn't mean that that's all who ever had the virus. Maybe another few percent had it and had gotten over it, didn't have the virus anymore, had antibodies, but the antibody testing wasn't available then. So still, the hypothesis is the penetration of the virus into the population has been very low, in the low single digits, and that when we see these curves, all these countries following the same curve, that's all of them following the same general societal pattern of catching the virus on the upswing as soon as they notice it's running away. And it appears that when they do that, they actually stop it before it gets into much more than 1% of the population. That's my theory. You heard it here. You can post your comments about evidence to the contrary. I would love evidence to the contrary, actually, or in support of, because that's been my theory for a bit, is that we're not seeing herd immunity in effect here. But I don't have, these numbers certainly don't show that, though they do show what percent of the population, for instance, tests, if we look by state here, what percent of the population has been tested. Let's see. Yeah, or what percent of the population we know has the virus. So if we look, for instance, at New York, or Louisiana is now the new winner in testing. More than 2.5% of the population tested. Having tested more than 2.5% of their population, Louisiana has, drum roll please, a total of, no, I want to have it per million. Louisiana has a total of, that's daily cases per million. I don't actually have this data. Well, okay, no, actually this is fine. This is fine. No, it doesn't. It doesn't tell me the total cases per million. So I actually don't know. But if I had the population of Louisiana at my fingertips, it's in the notebook here somewhere, but I don't have it at my fingertips, I could divide this by the population of Louisiana and say, what percent is that of Louisiana? And from there, I could say, all right, Louisiana has, let's suppose Louisiana's population is 10 million. I have no idea. It's less than New York, which is 20 million, less than, but say it's 10 million. It's probably could be off by a factor of 10. But if Louisiana's top population were 10 million, then 1% of that, so 10% of that's a million, 1% of that is 100,000, so this is 1/5% of the population. Then we could say we've tested 2.5% and 1/5% of the population. I'm not going to speculate on this. I'm going to say, what is the population of Louisiana? Then I can do this right here, live. Hey, I'm not too far off. 5 million. Okay, so 4/10 of the population has had coronavirus, or has a reported case of coronavirus. There are a lot of ways that this number can be skewed. People who have it but weren't reported, people who had it and died of it, we didn't even know that was why they died of it. Lots of ways, but let's just go with the numbers we got. That's mostly what I'm doing here anyway, and saying 4/10 of Louisiana had the coronavirus. We'll see if my numbers, you guys can all show up and say, you did the whole math wrong. I've been known to do math wrong, especially in my head. But still, I'm going to say 4/10, if that number, if my calculation is correct, 4/10 of Louisiana is reported to have coronavirus, and we're seeing it level off. And I have a feeling that's sort of, look at that leveling off. That is leveling off very visibly. And if we look at Louisiana now, we say, wow, there's this incredible, perfectly straight line going on here. New daily cases flattening out. They had a real peak. People were very afraid for Louisiana, and now look at they're down to 500 cases a day. Cases per million, similar line. And then here in Louisiana, we have this very nice graph. It has both of the things we like to see in the rope chart. It has a negative growth rate, in fact, a very high negative growth rate, 21% drop daily in new cases, and it's trending downward. So Louisiana is now looking great, and it's crossed the 0 line a week ago. And so here is where I'm saying Louisiana is not going to get to 1% of population, at least not in reported tests. It's because here it is already at 0.4%, turned downward a while ago. It might add another 2 or 3 tenths during the downslope, and maybe we'll end up at 6 or 7 tenths of a percent of the population. And this is the trend we see everywhere on all these states. What apparently we saw in Iceland, where they've got the best data, and this other place that I don't remember that did a very similar controlled test, a randomized controlled test. And it appears that at least the reported cases peak. The total reported cases do not typically exceed 1% of the population. Now, are there a whole lot more cases we don't know about? Maybe. The death rates can help us estimate that. I'm not going to go into that analysis here either, but if we wanted, we could take the death rates, we could multiply by 50 and say this is about how many total infected. We're not going to do that, but there's a lot that can be done here. My main point, though, is everything follows the same curve, and that curve takes control of the epidemic way before herd immunity. So here we have New York visibly turning down here, actually flattened and beginning to turn down. New York looking good. New Jersey also looking pretty good. It's not, the trend line doesn't yet say that it's turning downwards. I'm going to skip right to the rope chart because look at me going way over time again. The states look great. Just look at that. This was back again when I started, when around here even, was it? When did I start? I don't quite remember when my first one was. It was probably a little beyond here, maybe. I remember it was before. It was the end of March. But back here, it was a little bit chaotic. A little bit earlier, it was really chaotic and looked terrible. All the states were rising. They were all rising in tandem, I might add. Everyone rising together. There were a few of them that were flat that had already reached there, like Colorado and Ohio, I guess. Not sure. But those appeared to have been ahead of the curve in some sense. They'd already peaked and maybe have been heading down. Definitely have been heading down ever since. But this group of wild teenagers has become a coherent rope of adults, all heading in the same direction and in a good direction. And today I have the pleasure to show you something. Can't quite say that there's not a single state that hasn't turned the corner, but I can say that of the top 25, there is only a single state that hasn't turned the corner, and that is California. I wouldn't have predicted this. You look at California. Where was California? Back, see if I can pick it out. I probably can't. If you looked at California back here, I don't know quite where it was, but it was not trending upward, that's for sure. We don't see it here as it would if this line continued. So California has gotten worse. California is, as a whole, has broken away from the pack. It is not trending downward. It is trending slightly upward. It has not a terrible growth rate, but it's not zero. The growth rate is in the around 5% of new cases per day. California is definitely the worst of all the states that we're looking at here, which is the top 25, and those are the top 25 in terms of the number of the cases they have. So even if there are some in the 25 other states and territories that are showing a worse trend than California, it's not a big deal for the total numbers because they have so few cases to begin with. But California has a lot of cases. Let's look and see exactly where it fits in total cases, new cases, or let's just look at total cases. California's number of cases is the fifth. It's in fifth place. You can kind of see it blinking there. It's obviously way behind the leaders, the 2 or 3 leaders, but California is one of the worst in total cases, and it's trending in this very disturbing way. I'm going to zoom out a little bit just to see. Let you see the line here. So yeah, California headed downward. I think as of this point, the trend line, or even at this point maybe, the trend line was saying California's turned the corner along with everyone else, or I think it even turned the corner ahead of everyone else. And usually that means we're good. We're on a nice downhill slope to victory. We can no longer say that about California right now, though it's too soon. Certainly the fact that we have one terrible point here doesn't mean anything much. I mean, it's real. It's an average of 3 days. It's a definite uptick, but I'm not going to pay any attention to any particular point. These two, as you may recall, if you've been watching diligently, are probably just a missed day, and then that all the cases landed on that day. So those two really belong on this line here. But we have this long trend, ignoring that very bad point. We have this long trend right at zero of California just not getting any better, staying at the same number of new daily cases. So we fortunately have our own separate section on California, where we can go into a little bit about why that is. But big picture here, every single state except California has turned the corner and is heading towards negative growth. I guess we can say that New Jersey here isn't doing quite as well as everyone else, but as I've said, if you're well below zero, It's okay if you're horizontal. Horizontal just means you're not speeding, accelerating towards the finish line, but you're still going to get there. But California, whoa, bad news there in California. Um, let's see what else we can see here. Population testing. Well, I'll tell you one thing about California. It's testing. Oops, come on, California. You're going to do this to me again? Okay, it's going to do this to me again. I'm going to flash these, the California dots here. It's really hard to see. But California testing is in the lower, it's at the very bottom of all the states. Its testing is pretty much worse than everyone else. Up at the top, we've got Louisiana, which is the very best right now in testing, having passed New York. Louisiana with 2.5% of the population tested. New York's close to that. Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Washington State, as we've seen, has leveled out in testing because they more than anyone seem to have gotten over this thing. Connecticut, Tennessee, lots of good testing. Anyone above 0.4% is doing adequately. But at this point, California, I've been complaining about California's testing all along, especially when it was really terrible. Now it's just adequate. And I say, California, you need top-notch, world-class testing. Obviously, it can be done. Look at these states that are doing it. Look at Iceland with 8% or more. Look at South Korea. You can do better, and you need to, because you, California, are the worst. You're the worst. And then testing, I'm going to skip over this one today. Testing results per million, it just sort of shows the trends of testing. Definitely running long today, but California is such news that I probably will run long, just to get me. Actually, I'll check my calendar and see. Do I have something coming up at the hour? Yes, I do. All right, so I have a hard stop in 10 minutes. I got to go in 10 minutes, so I'm going to have to rush through this. 10 minutes is enough, though. Los Angeles, way up ahead of everybody. And this is, I'm sure, when we look at this more, as we're about to, Los Angeles is going to be the problem here. Actually, I'm not sure, but I think it is, because it's the major contributor. We may see some countries, some counties, in fact we will, like San Francisco, I'm guessing, or Santa Clara, that are growing in a more disturbing way than Los Angeles. Los Angeles may actually be pretty good, but still Los Angeles is the big contributor, and if it could wrap itself around, remember how we've seen some of these countries and states and that New York and so on, where they've started to just bend this thing downward and into a sort of a, I guess you can't see where I'm pointing with my cursor, but this is just heading upwards and to the right, and we need to have it level out and head downward. And if that were to happen, then California as a whole would start to look much better. So Los Angeles, it's all your fault. Now the daily corona cases by county, still Los Angeles is the leader, not quite as obvious. We have Riverside, we have San Bernardino, but I'm going to skip over all this because the real thing that really matters is the rope chart. So this is a rope chart fraying. This is a rope chart in chaos. Even California has never been really obviously turning the corner. There definitely have been times when it looked like it was, like back here where there was a slight downward tilt and it looked like it was maybe, and certainly I think Los Angeles looked like it had. Let's see. Los Angeles still looks like it's turned the corner. So good, I guess. Good. Los Angeles has turned the corner, but there is one other bad point. We saw this at the state level too. Again, it's all Los Angeles' fault because Los Angeles is by far the biggest contributor, and something has happened in the past 3 days to make this point crazy at 63% growth. So that it's almost like that day is pulling all these numbers. It's pulling that strand, the Los Angeles strand, upwards from what was a very nice downward line, and it's pulling the state completely out of the rope of the United States. But Los Angeles, nevertheless, still ignoring this point, and these points should probably be averaged to be a couple points right around here, those two, ignoring that one point, which could just be an outlier, hopefully is an outlier. Los Angeles at least does have the two characteristics we want to see, which is it's below zero in its growth rate at 13%, and it's trending downward. So good. And that means that over time this will recover itself. Los Angeles will shrink and shrink and shrink, and we'll see the whole state of California shrink with it, unless other problematic counties take its place. And that does show some possibility of happening. Well, Santa Barbara and San Joaquin are certainly way out there in terms of they're having the worst characteristics of growth here, where they have a very high 30% plus growth rate, and they have very rapid growth rate. So these are looking pretty bad right now. And they're not even really that small in cases. They're right in the middle of the pack. So either of these, San Joaquin or Santa Barbara, could absolutely take over this state in cases in a matter of weeks if they continue in this direction. Those are the worst two. We also have, in terms of sharp upwards, we have Santa Clara and we have San Luis Obispo. These are at least have a lower growth rate, but they are both trending upward. There's just a lot of upward trend here, where there was this place about a week ago where the rope sort of came together and maybe could have been thought to be turning back towards in a good direction, towards negative growth. It then just exploded outward. We've got a lot of great success stories here, but the bad news, so the ones that I've mentioned, also Riverside, San Bernardino, Sacramento, San Francisco is in the top 5. Let's just look at the top 5 actually, because as we see, there are a lot of success stories there, and we'll get to them briefly. But the top 5 they have one good success story, Los Angeles, which we've already seen. The rest, though, are mediocre to bad. No one's sharply upward, at least. Riverside, Santa Clara, Orange County, and San Diego are all horizontal. Santa Clara is looking pretty bad right now in its upward tilt. If we head down to San Francisco, that's maybe the worst of the bunch in the top. San Francisco has the most potential to blow up here because it is above zero, positive high 15% growth and rising. And Alameda looking good. San Mateo looking good. It's flat, but also well below zero and so shrinking. Sacramento looking just as bad as San Francisco. High growth rate and rising quickly. San Bernardino, high growth rate and rising fairly quickly. Contra Costa is looking great. Kern is okay. Ventura is just flat. San Joaquin, as we saw, it's one of the San Joaquin and Santa Barbara, both sharply upwards. And so we just have a lot of counties that have problems right now. And so the stuff I've been talking about, 4% testing is good enough. That plus shelter in place fixed it for South Korea. It's not obviously working right now for California. So we tuned in yesterday to the governor's speech about the 6 points about when they can open. Those 6 points are not going to be met. The 6 points about when they'd consider reopening parts of the state, they're not going to be met at this on these trajectories. We have a couple of weeks probably until they'll even really look and see if the 6 points are met. Right now, they're just sort of telling us what their metrics will be. But we're not doing well in California. And you can see with the testing rates at the lowest in the country, that's part of it. So may I suggest that California increase its testing? And here's some testing by county. We can see that county-wide, San Francisco, with almost 1% tested, is doing pretty well, though again, some of our states are doing 2.5 times that well. San Mateo, Marin, where is Santa Clara? Santa Clara is, it's doing pretty well, up above 0.8%. So these big counties that are really the problems right now, Santa Clara, San Francisco. Okay, what do we have on San Joaquin and Santa Barbara? The biggest problems. San Joaquin, we don't have data on testing at all. Santa Barbara is testing at a barely adequate rate for 0.4% tested. So more work to be done here. California not looking so great. I will briefly end with the good news, though, which is that when we look at the whole picture here, there are a lot of states that are showing, or a lot of counties that are showing good trajectory, and I'll go do them from second place to, or 10th place to first place. Orange County is holding in there, Ventura as well. San Diego's doing okay, negative growth rate, but not getting any better in growth rate, but that's good enough. It's got to be that way. That's good enough. Solano, good. Fresno, good. Alameda, good. San Mateo has a nice negative growth rate, but not getting any better. Again, that's good enough, but better to have that downward slant. Monterey is doing very well. Los Angeles is doing very well, and that's great because that's our biggest contributor. So if these other places can get their problems under control, the drop we're going to see from this in Los Angeles day over day will certainly bring our state numbers down in a good way. Placer, great. Contra Costa and Sonoma are the winners in all this. Where is Santa Cruz? My Santa Cruz peeps. Santa Cruz doing okay, not good enough really. It's got so few cases, as always, we can't say much. But if this really is the trend line, it's got to head downward before we can say we're doing well. It's got to be below 0 before we can say we're doing well. So this actually has both of the characteristics we don't want to see in a curve. It's above 0 and it's sloped upwards. However, it's only a little above 0 and only sloped a little upwards. So relative to your real problems, relative to, say, San Joaquin, if you look at Santa Cruz versus San Joaquin, if we set them up side by side, San Joaquin is what we really don't want to see. That looks terrible. Santa Cruz, it's got to improve. We've got to get better, but with so few cases, maybe that's just noise. So that's the news. That's the news for today. Good news in the world level. Good news on the country level. Not so good. I'd say balanced news, or maybe slightly negative news on the state level. So I guess I keep doing this because I certainly am not reaching a point where I can say everything is awesome, as they say in the Lego movie, and just move on to some new project. Everything is not awesome in the state of California. I'm Greg Farrar. That's the COVID trend analysis. Thank you for watching.